The day I got sued by my neighbor was the day I realized something most people learn way too late in life. Some folks don't actually want peace. They just want access. Access to your time, your patience, your property, your boundaries. And the moment you finally tell them no, they act like you've declared war. Now, if you told me 10 years ago that I'd end up sitting in a courtroom because a grown man believed he had a legal right to use my driveway whenever he felt like it, I would have laughed right in your face. Not because it sounded impossible, because it sounded too ridiculous to be real. But that's exactly what happened. My name's Ethan Carter, and this whole mess started in a quiet little neighborhood outside Knoxville, Tennessee. The kind of place where everybody waves when they drive by, everybody knows everybody's dog, and everybody pretends things are friendly even when they're keeping score of every little thing that happens on the street. I'd lived there about 6 years at the time. Nothing fancy. Just a modest brick house at the end of a long corner lot. After my divorce, that house became my fresh start. Every extra shift I worked, every weekend I spent renovating, every dollar I saved instead of spending, it all went into that place, especially the driveway. That probably sounds strange if you've never built one from scratch, but anybody who's poured money and sweat into a property understands exactly what I mean. Before I bought the house, there wasn't much there besides cracked pavement and weeds. I spent months cleaning it up, had contractors come in, expanded the driveway, added retaining walls, new landscaping. The whole thing cost more than I wanted to admit, but when it was finished it felt like mine, not because it was expensive, because I'd earned it. Across the street lived a guy named Gerald Whitmore, mid-60s, retired insurance salesman, always wearing pressed polo shirts like he was heading to a country club that didn't actually exist. The man carried himself with this strange confidence that made it seem like he personally approved every decision made within a 5-mile radius. At first, Gerald seemed harmless, friendly enough, talkative. One of those guys who always had an opinion whether you asked for it or not. The first time he used my driveway, I'd barely noticed. I was trimming hedges up front on a humid Saturday afternoon when his black SUV pulled halfway into my driveway, turned around, and headed back down the street. As he passed me, he lifted 2 fingers from the steering wheel. "Appreciate it, Ethan?" I nodded, didn't think twice about it. Honestly, why would I? People turn around in driveways all the time. No big deal, except then it happened again and again and again. A few weeks later, I started noticing a pattern. Every afternoon around 5, Gerald, same maneuver, same casual attitude. Then it wasn't just Gerald anymore. His daughter started doing it. Then his son. Then visiting friends. Then contractors. Then delivery drivers. At first, I kept making excuses. It's only a few seconds. It's not hurting anything, don't be that neighbor. Funny how often we talk ourselves out of addressing a problem simply because we don't want conflict. The truth is, I hated conflict. Always have. I grew up in a house where arguments lasted for weeks. Doors slammed, people stopped talking, everything became a battle. So as an adult, I went out of my way to avoid drama whenever possible. Unfortunately, people like Gerald have a way of detecting that. One evening I was eating dinner while watching a baseball game when headlights flashed across my living room window. Then another set, then another. 3 different vehicles using my driveway within 20 minutes. I paused the game and just sat there staring through the blinds, not angry, just tired, because every single time it happened it felt like somebody walking through your yard uninvited, small enough to ignore, annoying enough to remember. Then came the day my sister Melissa visited with her kids. That was the moment everything changed. We were unloading groceries from her SUV when Gerald came rolling backward into the driveway like he always did, only this time he came way too close. Melissa jumped backward and nearly dropped a case of bottled water. "Whoa, Jesus!" Gerald stopped for half a second, looked at her, then laughed. Actually laughed. "Didn't see you there." Then he drove away. My nephew Jake watched him leave before turning toward me. "Does that guy think he owns this place?" Everybody chuckled. Because, for the first time, I wasn't sure that was a joke. That night, I stood at my kitchen sink staring out at the driveway. The porch light reflected off the concrete. The landscaping looked exactly the way I'd imagined it years earlier when I first bought the property. And suddenly I realized something uncomfortable. This wasn't really about the driveway anymore. It was about boundaries. The driveway just happened to be where the problem showed itself. People talk a lot about respecting boundaries. But what they usually mean is respecting boundaries they personally agree with. The moment a boundary inconveniences them, suddenly you're unreasonable, difficult, sensitive, one of those people. A few days later, I finally decided to say something. Nothing dramatic, nothing aggressive, just a simple conversation. I caught Gerald while he was doing his usual turnaround after dinner. I walked down to the curb and raised a hand. "Hey, Gerald, got a second?" He stopped and rolled down his window. "What's up, buddy?" I smiled politely. "Would you mind not using the driveway to turn around anymore? We've had a couple close calls lately, and honestly, it's becoming a bit of a problem." For a second, he just stared at me. Then he laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not an embarrassed laugh, a dismissive laugh, like I'd just told him gravity was optional. "Come on, Ethan." He leaned his arm on the door. "It's just a driveway. It's private property." He grinned. "People use it. That's what happens in neighborhoods." I remember that exact smile, the kind people wear when they've already decided your opinion doesn't matter. Then he said something that stuck with me for months. "You don't want to become one of those neighbors." One of those neighbors. You ever notice how people say things like that right before they justify crossing a line? I looked at him and realized we weren't having the same conversation. I thought we were discussing respect. He thought we were negotiating how much access he deserved. And those are two very different things. As Gerald drove away, something in my gut told me this wasn't over. Not even close. Because for the first time since I'd moved into that neighborhood, somebody had told him no. And judging by the look on his face, he wasn't used to hearing it. Looking back now, I think the biggest mistake I made was believing that a reasonable request would get a reasonable response. It sounds obvious when you say it out loud, but most of us assume that if we're polite enough, calm enough, patient enough, eventually the other person will meet us halfway. The problem is, some people don't see patience as kindness. They see it as weakness. And Gerald Whitmore was one of those people. For about a week after our conversation, things actually seemed better. No SUVs, no delivery trucks, no surprise turnarounds. I started thinking maybe he'd gotten the message. Maybe I'd built the whole thing up in my head. Maybe he just needed someone to say something. Then Tuesday morning happened. At exactly 6:17 a.m., I woke up to the sound of diesel engine noise vibrating through my bedroom wall. You know that sound. The kind that immediately tells you somebody with a trailer is about to make your morning worse. I pulled back the curtain and saw a landscaping truck halfway across my driveway. The trailer behind it had cut so sharply that both wheels were digging into the edge of my lawn. Fresh dirt was flying. Grass was getting shredded. The driver looked about 19 years old and completely clueless. I threw on a sweatshirt and walked outside. "Hey!" The kid pulled out one earbud. "Yeah, this is private property." He blinked, then pointed across the street. "Mr. Whitmore said everybody uses it." Everybody. That word again. I swear if I ever write a book about neighborhood disputes, that'll be the title. Everybody. Because somehow the moment enough people start doing something wrong, somebody decides it becomes acceptable. The kid wasn't the problem. He was just following instructions. So I told him to please avoid the driveway and he apologized immediately. Nice kid. Polite. Gone in 30 seconds. But the damage wasn't really in the lawn. The damage was realizing Gerald had apparently been telling people my property was community property. That evening I sat on the porch with a beer and watched the neighborhood settle down. Kids riding bikes. Dogs barking, sprinklers clicking away. Normal suburban life. And I kept asking myself one question. How much longer was I supposed to tolerate this? Because every time I let it slide, the behavior got worse. Every single time. Finally, I ordered a sign. Nothing dramatic. No threats. No giant warning labels. Just a simple black aluminum sign. Pierre Ivake, drive it away, no turnaround. That was it. Honestly, it looked pretty classy. The sign arrived 3 days later. I installed it near the entrance of the driveway on a Saturday afternoon. Stepped back. Looked at it. Done. Problem solved. At least that's what I thought. The funny thing is, the sign actually worked. For almost 2 weeks. No traffic. No random vehicles. No headlights sweeping through my windows during dinner. For the first time in months, I stopped paying attention. Stopped watching. Stopped worrying. Life returned to normal. And that's exactly when Gerald decided to escalate. It happened on a Thursday evening. I had just gotten home from work. The sun was starting to set. I pulled into my driveway and immediately noticed a silver sedan parked near the curb. A man in a charcoal suit stood on my front porch holding a large envelope. Now, I don't know about you, but there are certain sights that instantly make your stomach drop. A man carrying legal paperwork is one of them. The second I saw him, I knew whatever was inside that envelope wasn't going to improve my evening. He walked toward me. You, Ethan Carter? Yeah. He handed me the envelope. You've been served. Then he turned around and left. Just like that. No explanation. No conversation. Nothing. I stood there holding the paperwork while trying to process what had just happened, and then I noticed movement across the street. Gerald, standing in his driveway, holding a garden hose, watering absolutely nothing. The man wasn't even pretending very hard. He was watching me, waiting for my reaction. Like he was sitting front row at a movie premiere. I took the paperwork inside, opened it at the kitchen table, started reading. Halfway through the first page, I honestly thought I was misunderstanding something. Then I reread it, then I read it again. Nope, I understood perfectly. Gerald Whitmore was suing me, not because I'd damaged his property, not because we'd had an accident, not because anybody got hurt. He was suing me because I put up a sign. According to the lawsuit, I had unlawfully interfered with a historically established access route that neighborhood residents had relied upon for years. Years. The complaint claimed the driveway had functioned as an accepted turnaround area for over a decade. Gerald argued that by restricting access, I'd caused him inconvenience, emotional distress, and disruption to established community practices. I wish I were making that up. Emotional distress, because he couldn't cut through somebody else's property. I actually laughed. A loud laugh, the kind that comes from pure disbelief. Then about 30 seconds later, I stopped laughing. Because here's the thing nobody tells you. Even ridiculous lawsuits become scary the moment your name appears on official court documents. Suddenly everything feels serious. Suddenly stupidity has legal fees attached. That night I barely slept. I kept pacing around my house, replaying every interaction I'd ever had with Gerald. The more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't really about the driveway. It never had been. The driveway was just the battlefield. The real issue was control. Gerald had spent years acting like an unofficial mayor of the neighborhood. He organized cookouts, welcomed new residents, shared unsolicited advice, commented on landscaping projects, talked about how things had always been done around here. At first it seemed harmless. Then you started noticing something. Everything had to go through Gerald. Every opinion, every decision, every neighborhood tradition. And if somebody disagreed, well, suddenly they weren't team players anymore. I think the sign embarrassed him, not because it blocked his turnaround, because it publicly proved he wasn't in charge. The next morning I called an attorney. Her name was Rebecca Lawson. Early 60s, sharp eyes, sharp mind. The kind of lawyer who looked like she'd already won arguments before they started. I handed her the lawsuit. She spent about 2 minutes reading it, then lowered the papers, stared at me, and said the most reassuring thing I'd heard all week. "You're kidding." "I wish." She flipped another page, then another, then leaned back. "So let me get this straight. Okay, your neighbor is suing you because he believes he has a legal right to trespass." That's pretty much the summary. For the first time she smiled, not because it was funny, because she smelled blood in the water. The following week became a crash course in property law. Rebecca requested county records, construction permits, property surveys, archived planning documents, anything that might help establish the actual history of the property. And that's when we found the first crack in Gerald's entire story. The driveway wasn't old, not even close. The current driveway had only existed for 4 years. Before that, grass, just grass. Uneven grass, a sloped patch of yard that nobody could have reasonably used as a permanent turnaround route. Rebecca pulled up historical aerial images from county records. The first photo appeared on her monitor. Grass. The second, grass. Third, grass. Fourth, still grass. She kept clicking through year after year while I sat there watching. Then finally construction equipment appeared. Fresh grading, concrete work, retaining walls. The driveway. Rebecca nearly laughed. "Oh, this is beautiful." I leaned closer. "What?" She pointed at the timeline. "His entire lawsuit depends on historical use." I nodded. "Okay." She smiled wider. The structure he's claiming historical rights to didn't exist. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then realization hit me. Hard. Gerald wasn't exaggerating. He wasn't mistaken. He wasn't remembering things differently. He was lying. And not just casually lying. He'd filed sworn legal documents built around a claim that could be disproven by a photograph. That's a different level of confidence. Or desperation. Maybe both. Rebecca started organizing evidence immediately. The more documents we uncovered, the worse it looked for Gerald. Property maps contradicted his claims. Permit records contradicted his claims. Construction dates contradicted his claims. Everything contradicted his claims. Still, Rebecca warned me not to celebrate yet, because people who build their identity around being right don't surrender easily, especially when pride gets involved. And a few days before the hearing, Gerald proved exactly how right she was. 3 days before the hearing, I was checking my mailbox when I heard somebody clear their throat behind me. I turned around. Gerald. Of course, he was standing at the edge of his driveway with both hands in his pockets, wearing that same practiced smile I'd seen 100 times before. The smile that always looked friendly until you paid attention to his eyes. "Morning, Ethan. Morning." For a second, neither of us said anything. Then he slowly walked closer. "You know," he said, "we could still settle all this." I almost laughed. "Settle what?" He shrugged. "The situation." I stared at him. "Gerald, you sued me." His smile tightened. "Because you forced the issue." There it was again. That bizarre ability to rewrite reality in real time. Somehow, my decision to protect my own property had become an act of aggression. His lawsuit had become self-defense. I honestly couldn't tell whether he believed it or not anymore. Then he leaned slightly closer. Not enough to be threatening, just enough to make the conversation uncomfortable. "You know people talk," I nodded. "People always talk. They don't like difficult neighbors." There it was, the real message. Not a legal threat, a social threat. The same thing he'd been relying on from the beginning. Fall in line, keep everybody comfortable. Don't make waves. Don't challenge the guy who's been here longest. For years, that strategy had probably worked. Maybe on other neighbors. Maybe on entire groups of people. But by that point, something had changed inside me. I wasn't angry anymore. Honestly, anger would have been easier. I was just done. Negotiating boundaries. Done defending common sense. Done pretending this was normal. So I smiled and said the only thing that came to mind. Good thing this isn't a popularity contest. The smile disappeared from his face instantly. Not gradually. Instantly. For a brief second, I saw the real Gerald. No charm, no friendliness, no neighborhood ambassador act, just a man who couldn't handle hearing no. Then he nodded once, turned around, and walked away. The hearing took place on a rainy Thursday morning. The courthouse sat about 30 minutes outside town. Small building, old brick exterior, the kind of place where everybody's footsteps seem louder than they should. I arrived early. Rebecca was already there, 2 folders under her arm. Coffee in one hand, completely relaxed, which was comforting because I was absolutely not relaxed. Even when you're innocent, court feels intimidating. The language, the procedures, the formality, everything makes you feel like you're one mistake away from disaster. Meanwhile, Gerald arrived looking strangely confident, almost cheerful, like he was attending an award ceremony instead of a legal hearing. He even nodded at me. That same smug little nod. The one people give when they've already convinced themselves they've won. About 20 minutes later, we were seated. Judge Walter Hayes entered the courtroom, late 60s, gray hair, reading glasses, a face that suggested he'd spent decades listening to people make bad decisions. The hearing started. Gerald's attorney spoke first, and honestly, it was impressive. Not because the argument was good, because he delivered it with absolute confidence. He talked about community reliance, customary access, long-standing neighborhood practices, historical use. By the time he finished, you'd think my driveway had been some critical piece of public infrastructure connecting civilizations. Then Gerald took the stand. And that's where things became interesting. He sat upright, looked directly at the judge, and repeated the same story he'd been telling from the beginning, that residents had relied on the driveway for over 10 years, that the access had become established, that removing it caused hardship, the whole thing. The judge listened patiently, asked a few questions, took notes. Then Rebecca stood, and everything changed. She walked calmly to the presentation monitor. No dramatic speech, no theatrics, just quiet confidence. "Your Honor," she said, "I'd like to introduce a series of county planning records and archived aerial images." The judge nodded. "Proceed." Rebecca clicked the remote. The first image appeared, an aerial view of my property from 8 years earlier. Grass. Nothing else, just grass. She clicked again. 7 years earlier. Grass. Again. 6 years earlier. Grass. Again. 6 years earlier. Grass. Again. 5 years earlier. Still grass. The courtroom became very quiet. Rebecca continued advancing through the images one by one. Every photograph told the same story. No driveway, no turnaround route, no access lane. Nothing. Then finally, construction equipment appeared. Fresh excavation, concrete forms, building activity, and then the completed driveway. The one I'd paid for, the one I'd built, the one Gerald now claimed he possessed historical rights to. I looked toward the plaintiff table. Gerald had stopped smiling. His face looked strangely pale. Rebecca let the final image remain on the screen. Then she turned toward the judge. The driveway in question was constructed 4 years ago. Silence. She continued. The plaintiff's claim relies upon more than a decade of continuous historical use. More silence. Then the judge slowly removed his glasses, looked at the screen, looked at Gerald, then back at the screen. Finally he spoke. Mr. Whitmore. Gerald shifted in his seat. Yes, Your Honor. The judge tilted his head slightly. Are you claiming to have established a historical easement over a structure that did not yet exist? For a second, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. It felt like the entire room froze. Gerald opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Well, people drove through the area sometimes. The judge raised one hand. No. The single word landed like a hammer. No. The single word landed like a hammer. He leaned forward slightly. Answer the question. Gerald looked toward his attorney. His attorney looked like a man desperately wishing for a fire alarm. Your Honor, the attorney began, the issue involves community reliance, and, the judge interrupted, you cannot acquire permanent legal rights to infrastructure that had not been built. Silence. Absolute silence. The kind of silence that feels loud. I remember hearing somebody cough in the back of the courtroom. That was it. That was the entire soundtrack. Gerald stared at the table. Rebecca didn't smile, didn't react, didn't celebrate. She just stood there calmly while the facts did all the work. A few minutes later, Judge Hayes delivered his ruling. The lawsuit was dismissed. Immediately. Not delayed. Not reconsidered. Dismissed. Then came the part I'll never forget. The judge looked directly at Gerald, not angry, not emotional, just tired, the way teachers look at students who should know better. The court strongly discourages attempts to weaponize unsupported property claims against neighboring landowners. Professional language. Simple translation. Stop wasting everybody's time. Then he awarded legal fees, my legal fees, to be paid by Gerald. Suddenly the world's most expensive driveway turnaround became even more expensive. Outside the courthouse, rain was still falling. Rebecca and I stood beneath the entrance awning watching people leave. Gerald emerged a few minutes later. No smile this time. No confidence, no speech. He walked straight past us without saying a word. His attorney followed behind, carrying several boxes and looking like a man re-evaluating every life decision he'd ever made. After they disappeared into the parking lot, Rebecca took a sip of coffee. You know what's funny? What? She looked toward the rain. He probably still thinks he's right. And honestly, I think she was. Because entitlement does something strange to people. If they live inside it long enough, they stop recognizing it. Convenience becomes a right. Boundaries become insults. Consequences become persecution. The next morning, I sat on my porch drinking coffee just after sunrise. Everything felt unusually quiet. Around 7:30, I spotted a familiar black SUV approaching from down the street. Gerald, instinctively, he slowed near my driveway. I watched, curious. For one brief moment, I honestly wondered whether he'd do it again. Whether losing in court had changed anything at all. The SUV stopped, not in the driveway. Near it, just sitting there, I could almost see the internal argument happening through the windshield. Then finally, he drove past, continued another few hundred yards, reached the cul-de-sac, and performed the most awkward 12-point turn I've ever witnessed. It took forever. Watching it should have felt childish, petty, immature. Instead, it felt strangely satisfying. Not because I won, not because he lost, because for the first time since moving into that neighborhood, reality had finally reached him. My boundaries existed, whether he liked them or not. These days, we barely speak. Occasionally, we'll cross paths, checking the mail. Maybe exchange a nod, nothing more. The fake friendliness is gone, and honestly, that's probably healthier. as not every conflict ends with friendship. Sometimes the best ending is simply clarity. Still, every once in a while I wonder something. What would have happened if I'd never put up that sign? How far would Gerald have pushed things if nobody ever challenged him? Would he have eventually stopped on his own? Or would the behavior have continued getting worse year after year because everybody around him kept choosing comfort over confrontation? And that's the question I want to leave with you. At what point does being neighborly stop being kindness and start becoming permission? Would you have ignored it? Would you have confronted him sooner? Or do you think taking the issue all the way to court was the only way this story could have ended? Let me know down in the comments, because situations like this happen in neighborhoods all over the country. And I have a feeling people are going to have very different opinions about where the line should have been drawn. And if you've ever dealt with a neighbor who treated your boundaries like suggestions instead of rules, I'd love to hear that story too. Because sometimes the most unbelievable conflicts start as something as simple as a driveway and end with a judge reminding somebody that no means no.